The proceeding is currently in private.
Welcome everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee for a one-off evidence session on the topic of fiduciary duties. A very warm welcome to our first panel who've joined us. Thank you all for being here. And can I ask each of you very briefly to tell us who you are, starting with Lewis Johnston.
Certainly, thank you, Chair. My name is Lewis Johnston. I am Director of Policy at ShareAction, and we're an organisation that works to make sure that the financial system works for everyone and for people and planet.
Thank you. Tony Burdon.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Tony Burdon. I'm the CEO of Make My Money Matter. We're a campaign that engages people and organisations with their money, including pensions, and try to drive those investments into more sustainable approaches.
Thank you. Charlotte O'Leary.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Charlotte O'Leary. I'm the CEO at Pensions for Purpose. We're a profit-for-purpose organisation, a B Corporation, that works with all actors in the investment chain, from pension funds all the way through to asset managers. So this particular topic is very, very close to our hearts and something we see with a number of our members.
Thank you. And James Alexander.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm James Alexander, Chief Exec of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association, known as UK SIF. We're the membership network for sustainable finance in the UK, and our members include banks, pension funds, asset managers, data providers, and others involved in the investment industry. We have 320 members, and they manage £19 trillion of assets.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being with us. Let me put the first question to you, if I may. Can you, each of you, tell us what evidence you think there is that pension trustees' fiduciary duties are problematic for addressing climate change in their investment decisions? What do you think should be done about it, and what the consequences would be if nothing is done? Starting with Lewis Johnston.
Certainly, thank you, Chair. Well, I mean, as I said before, we at ShareAction are committed to making sure the financial system works for people in all the ways that matter to them. Now, financial return is obviously a key part of that, but other impacts are as well, including climate change, but also wider social factors. Now, pensions are such a crucial part of the investment system precisely because they are the point at which most people are connected to the financial system, to the capital markets. And there are, I guess, you can think of it as three ways in which pension investments operate. They enable commercial activities and projects. They obtain a return from those commercial activities and projects to pay a retirement income to their members. And they also have an impact on their members' interests through the impacts of the activities that they finance. Now, the problem is that at the moment, fiduciary duty is framed in such a way that trustees are unable to take a full account of the impacts of some of the activities that they invest in on their members. We are emphatic that the centre point of all of this has to be the member of the pension scheme. That it's their interests that trustees are there to serve, and the way that the law is currently framed actually prevents trustees from fully exercising that duty. Now,
can I just press you on that? You think it's the law itself, or is it the understanding of the law which is the problem?
I think it's both, but ultimately I think it is the law itself. Because it does not, it's framed purely in terms, it's almost an inside-out approach, an outside-in approach, where the scheme trustees assess return and risk and balance that in terms of the outside, the impact of the outside world on the returns of the scheme. What it disregards is the agency and role of that scheme in shaping those effects and those impacts in the real world. And I think that's a really, really important distinction. And I think, so I certainly think there needs to be a change in the law in that respect. There's a lot of evidence for why the status quo, so I've kind of explained there how we see the problem. The evidence for that is manifold, but one of the most convincing elements, I think, is the fact that pension schemes are reflective of the wider economy, and the wider economy is not aligned with and consistent with a Paris-aligned approach and a net zero transition at the moment. So there's a passivity built into the system of pension scheme investments here, rather than pension schemes actively working to shape the world into which their members are going to retire into. They're passively kind of almost buffeted by the wider financial system and the economy in which they're investing. What I think, if you were to see a change in the law so that pension trustees are required to co-manage risk, return and impacts, then that would really enable them to take a much more comprehensive view of how what they do and their investment strategies impact on their members, and really empower them to act in the best interests of those members ultimately.
Thank you very much. Tony Burdon.
Thank you. Well, our view is that we currently have a system, a pension systems whose investments are destroying the very retirement of people who are saving into those schemes. Today we launched our 2024 Climate Action Report, and it ranks the top 20 defined contribution workplace pension providers against a range of climate actions. I'll just briefly show our table that ranks them. And all of these pension funds, from Aviva to the People's Pension, have made net zero commitments. And you'll see a range of measures. What I want to draw your attention to is that on fossil fuels and deforestation, almost all of the providers get red marks. And what we're seeing is that all of our schemes are investing in oil and gas companies that are planning expansion, which will break any chance of achieving the limiting of global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, I'll just say a little bit more about temperature rises and the potential impacts, because that will affect returns in the future and the well-being of pensioners in the future. So if you think of food production, at 1.5 degrees of global warming, we're already seeing reductions in crop production across the world. At 2 degrees centigrade, maize, for instance, has a 50% chance of a global crop failure. At 3 degrees, we get ecosystem collapse. So we're going to see some, very massive shocks on the global economy and on the investments of pension savers. And that's not including the effect of tipping points, where you get compounding impacts coming together. So this is extremely worrying. So when you have a set of scenarios like that with temperature rises, and you couple that to trustee capacity and risk aversion, coupled with climate risk advice, that we've seen evidence, Carbon Tracker and others have exposed this, where investment consultants such as Aon and Mercer and Hymans Robertson are advising trustees that the future impacts of these temperature rises are marginal on GDP and therefore marginal on future returns. So we have a context where trustees are not properly taking into account future impacts. They're investing more in the short term, and then that's undermining the future of pension savers. So that mix of trustee capability, understanding of climate impacts, poor advice from some investment consultants is all compounding very, very serious risks to the future of the younger generation and their savings in the future.
Thank you very much. Charlotte O'Leary.
Thank you. So I'm going to give some sort of practical examples based on the fact that we work with pension funds and asset managers and consultants. In relation to the point on fiduciary duty, we think it's permissive, but permissive doesn't mean that it's working. What we see is a number of pension schemes, usually the ones that are very well resourced, have good governance structures, budget, resource, being able to take advantage and do a lot more on systemic risks and opportunities, and I'll emphasise opportunities.
Can I just pick you up on that just to make sure I've understood your position correctly? I think you're saying then that you think the law as it stands is okay, but it's the way that people are understanding and interpreting it that needs to...
The interpretation, I think, is leading to problems. For us to have such a wide disparity between those that are investing in line with what we're trying to achieve from a climate change perspective to those that are not considering it at all, means that there is something fundamentally wrong in either the interpretation, and I'm not coming from a legal background, or with the law itself. Now, our view is it's the interpretation based on the training that we give to trustees, but it's also capacity. So I think all of you are aware of the FMLC report that came out. One of the key things in that is that pension funds are actors in a system. They aren't divorced from it. They can't make separate decisions. And at the moment, they're being put at odds with what the system is trying to achieve. So one of the things that we've suggested is guidance, for trustees to aid them in their decision making, but also an understanding that they heavily rely on their advisors, who are themselves companies, and they also invest in companies, and their sponsors are companies. So one of the things that I suggested as a consideration is changes to the Companies Act that would align what we're trying to get trustees to do with what companies are doing. And there is currently the Better Business Act campaign, which is about changing Section 172 to align company director responsibilities so that that isn't about short-term profit maximisation. So there are two clear things there that we're suggesting: guidance for trustees, which we think needs to come from TPR, and changes to the Companies Act.
Thank you very much. And James Alexander.
Thank you. I think the liabilities of pension funds now extend for an extremely long way into the future. Many of our members have liabilities running past 2100. And that is that long-term thinking that I think is one of the really key challenges that pension funds need to grapple with. And so we deal with a lot of pension funds and their trustees. Being a pension fund trustee is an extremely difficult job. The range of different pieces that need to be considered are enormous. The regulation that they have to comply with is obviously substantial, and many of that for good reason. And so as a result, pension funds and trustees often take out advice on how to best discharge their duties as trustees. And so I think that's where one of the challenges lies, is an inconsistent interpretation of fiduciary duties by trustees, often because of the advice that they receive and the investment advice that they receive on how to interpret fiduciary duties. Some take a very a strong view that it's only financial factors in their purest sense that should be considered, and that's often short-term financial factors, and others take a different approach, which would be more aligned to considering the long-term sustainability and climate impacts of investments as well as other things. And I think that's where we want to see more clarity and clarification of fiduciary duties in the concept of considering the wider economy, the system that the pension fund is operating in. A pension fund is not by its very nature divorced from the economy. It is a part of the economy, and what happens to the economy has a massive impact on that pension fund and its future success. And so in that context, we think pension funds and trustees need to think about fiduciary duties in the way that they're currently drafted, but interpret that in a way that suggests that many more factors are financial factors than are currently considered or frequently considered. And just very quickly, the Financial Market Law Committee report that Charlotte mentioned, I think, does an extremely good job of highlighting and indicating how that committee's expert opinion suggests that climate change and many other sustainability factors, there's an extremely strong case for them to be considered as financial factors. What we now want to see is this report from the FMLC taken on by the pensions regulator and codified into guidance for trustees, and we think this committee could do a nice job by writing to the pensions regulator to ask them to look at that.
Thank you very much. Selene Saxby.
Thank you and good morning. In 2021, the government introduced mandatory climate-related reporting for pension schemes, and one of the aims was to encourage trustees to think more thoroughly about the risks and opportunities of a transition to a low-carbon economy. How effective do you think this reporting has been? Who'd like to go first? James, did you want to start?
I can jump in. So it's great. It's great that reporting is there. It's so important that we consider and have this reporting across the landscape. And in fact, we want to see that more moving into the corporate space as well. So corporates are reporting, which allows pension fund trustees to get the full range of information and data that they need to make those decisions. I think that reporting is having a positive impact, but as Tony and others have highlighted, I think there's still quite a way to go before all those factors are taken into account as thoroughly as they should be. And then it still doesn't necessarily change the interpretation of fiduciary duties around what parts of that reporting to include and consider as part of an investment decision.
Is there anything you'd like to add? Yes, Charlotte.
Yeah, so we actually put out market research on TCFD reporting from last year. It was debated in the House of Lords by Baroness Ros Altman. And we did demonstrate that although transparency is important, disclosures are important, the action that is happening as a result of that is minimal. And a lot of that is happening as a result of a lack of data or improper advice or incomplete advice. And so therefore, while it has raised it in terms of being on the agenda, it's not leading to sufficient action.
I agree. I mean, it's vital that we have that data. This is a disclosures framework. We use that data in assessing the performance of schemes, but it's not really leading to trustees driving action in tackling climate risk in a serious way.
And that was sort of my follow-on question coming to you, Tony, then is how has it changed trustees' investment decision-making or how they invest?
So I don't think it has. I think there are still these, serious risk aversion, lack of understanding, the weighting of short-term versus long-term, as James described. But it's early years yet. These reports have only been out for a couple of years. So there's more to do, but it's just not enough. It's not driving a real change.
Thank you, Lewis.
Thank you. I just want to reinforce this point that, we've been supportive of disclosure regimes and the implementation of TCFD for a long time, but ultimately we're not going to disclose our way to net zero. And I think your follow-up question was really pertinent around, what's been the real world outcome of this. And ultimately, we're still not seeing that alignment. As I said before, there's this reflection of the wider economy which is not aligned with a net zero transition. There's also this issue that in the intervening 3 years, a lot of the models, the climate models on which certain assumptions are based have been shown to be deficient. So there was evidence from research from Carbon Tracker and the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, which showed some of those deficiencies, which is important as well. And I think just finally, I think whilst guidance and clarification and requirements to disclose and things like that, they're all worthwhile. Ultimately, though, what it's going to come down to, and what trustees are going to look to, and their advisors are going to look to, is what they're required to do, what their fiduciary duties require them to do in law. And I think at the moment that does not integrate impacts, and that's why we need to see that legal change. There is a lot to build on in the FMLC report, and again, I think it was an incredibly nuanced and thoughtful document. But it's important to understand what its remit was, and it was not to provide legal advice or guidance, and ultimately that needs to be enshrined elsewhere.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Desmond Swain.
So I'm after your principal concerns about the way that fiduciary duties are being interpreted. Now, we've already covered some of this ground. Certainly, James, you've referred to the timescale not being sufficiently cognizant of the breadth of time over which some investments will have an impact. And Tony, clearly, you've given some scenarios over which investors, trustees are not sufficiently cognizant of the impact of investments that they have. But has anyone got any other concerns or would to add to those? I mean, are the timeframes just the issue? Is it that a particular investment isn't considered in the breadth by which it should?
I think one of the other things we need to consider is the sort of DEI component of trustees. And, trustees are there to honour the benefits of all of their members, youngest and oldest. And it is within that context that systemic risks and opportunities like climate change need to be viewed. And in fact, we found that when you couch it in those terms, that you have the same obligation to your oldest member as you do to your youngest member, it becomes a very different mindset. So that point about time frame isn't just time frame of the investment, it's time frame in relation to the cohort for which you represent. Now that then becomes more than about just investments, because remember, investment returns are just one dimension. Contributions are a massive factor here, and we're focused on climate change. One of the biggest risks we face for pensions is a lack of contributions. You know, at the moment we've got staggering gaps, and particularly around gender. You know, the government itself has issued reports showing that the gender pension gap in defined contribution pension schemes is an eye-watering 60%. So, you know, in terms of thinking about fiduciary duty, there are many things that are not being addressed here. And I do think it's worth pointing that out. And the FMLC report didn't get to the point about contributions.
To add, I very much agree, and the committee has looked at this as well. But we do have that double whammy of millions of British people not saving enough. They're looking forward to a very bleak retirement. And then you compound that with the impact of the climate crisis on pensions and on returns and on their well-being. That's a pretty appalling prospect for millions of British people. But just to add on this, I do think there is a serious risk that many trustees are failing in their fiduciary duty and potentially subject to legal challenge. And that's because they're weighting current pensioners more highly than pensioners in the future. As James said, many will look to retirement in 2100. Now, what does that world look like? Currently, we're on track to see 2.5 degrees more of warming by 2100. So I highlighted, as you said, Sir Desmond, some of those impacts. That's an appalling scenario. Yet for our trustees, they might be weighting oil and gas investments as good for the scheme because of current high returns, ignoring the damage that expansion of those industries will cause to our planet, exacerbating the climate crisis to those future pensioners when they retire in 2100. And I see that as a serious failure of trustees. That's why the FMLC paper quite clearly states that trustees should consider rejecting short-term gains because they create long-term risks to the fund. Now, with this, risk aversion of trustees, compounded by risk-averse investment consultants, risk-averse pension lawyers, we just get a structure where trustees are not stepping up to this. And that's why, again, we need very clear guidance that the FMLC paper should be translated into clearer language, a bit more directive to trustees, so that they have confidence that they're operating legally in making these decisions.
The Society of Pension Lawyers, if I paraphrase what they've said, says actually the fiduciary duties are perfectly clear. The complexity arises when we try and shoehorn quite different objectives into them, like climate change. So are we agreed at least that the principal fiduciary duty is the financial welfare of the members of the fund? And can that be where will it be legitimate to compromise that by introducing climate change? So, for example, would it be possible to set aside concerns about climate change because of the financial interests of the members of the fund?
I think
just to take up this point, I think this is a really, really important point, because what should not be misunderstood about the argument that certainly we're putting forward is this idea that the primary role of a scheme is to serve the interests of their members. And we're not for one moment saying that they should be subordinated to any other agenda, whether that's a climate agenda or a social agenda or anything like that. The primary purpose of a pension is to deliver an income in retirement. What we're saying is that at the moment, the way that fiduciary duty is framed does not allow trustees to properly serve those interests because of this myopic way in which everything has to be considered in terms of the financial impact on the scheme. By integrating the impacts of a scheme on those wider factors, you're empowering trustees to properly understand in a more comprehensive way, is their strategy in the best interests of those members? And I think, to your second point about, when you really come down to it, should there be this trade-off? I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy, because trustees are already expected to manage and balance lots of different aspects. So, you wouldn't have a strategy that just went for the highest return, irrespective of any other risks. What we're saying is that by integrating impacts alongside return and risks as well, you allow for a much better outcome, and you really do a service to those beneficiaries now and in the future. And it addresses the time horizon point that Tony has made as well.
I just come back to the point that I made initially, which is you can't ask something of pension fund trustees that the rest of the financial system is not being required to do. So if the Companies Act states that company directors can pursue short-term maximisation of profit, you cannot expect pension funds to be considering something other than that. And so it has to be an aligned system. If you're asking pension fund trustees to consider long-term systemic risks and opportunities, it must be right that asset managers, investment consultants, legal advisors must be doing the same. How on earth can you have a system that is entirely out of line?
So, thank you for the question. I think fiduciary duties are well established in the context of, as Lewis also said, in relation to looking into the financial factors. The difficulty or the difference of opinion emerges, and this is where there's a considerable challenge that we're really, I think, all of us talking about today, is the way that this is interpreted, is how people define what is and isn't a financial factor, with specific relation to timeframes and the time frame over which an investment is made. And obviously a pension fund, as we've all said, is a very long-term investment proposition. And also the other factor is the definition of climate, sustainability and other system-wide challenges as financial components in fiduciary duties. And that is so it's not the problem necessarily with fiduciary duties per se, it's a problem with how they're being interpreted across the board. And that's why we think that this FMLC paper should become guidance to trustees, and let's see how that beds in, because we think that will have a very substantial aligning of the range of different understandings and do a really strong job of clarifying what fiduciary duties is all about.
And just to say again, because it's a really pertinent question, it's climate change isn't the objective. What's the objective is for trustees, the members' best interests. And as the FMLC paper says, climate risk is financially material. So therefore it has to be considered. And by just reinforcing these issues around temperature rises, they're catastrophically financially material. And that's why it's so important they're considered.
So, coming to the Financial Markets Law Committee, they set out to provide a general explanation of the legal positions, uncertainties and difficulties facing fiduciary duty. Did they succeed? What's left unresolved? Aside from what you said, Charlotte, about never having got to contributions.
So I mean, firstly, you explained the remit obviously very well there, and I think in terms of that remit, they've certainly delivered. I think it's a really, really thoughtful and nuanced document. The question is, will it achieve what we need to achieve in terms of actually empowering trustees and giving them the confidence to integrate some of these factors that they currently feel unable to do? And we've seen this kind of guidance before, so in 2014 and 2017 from the Law Commission, and we've now seen again and again, just to emphasise that the FMLC report was not there to provide guidance or legal advice. It was to clarify the difficulties and questions that arise, and it did that very well. We're still left in a position where I think trustees need that confidence given to them through a redefinition of the best interests of their beneficiaries in the law to allow them to take this into account. Because we've seen guidance hasn't worked. It's been, over the last 10 years, it hasn't been able to do that. And you can change the law in a way that preserves that core duty to act in the financial interests of your beneficiaries. It preserves the discretion, the core principles of prudence and loyalty are all still there, but it just integrates this point about the impact of the scheme, and it doesn't treat pension investments as a kind of passive actor, kind of bobbing along in the wider economy. It takes account of their role in shaping that world and shaping that economy.
So are you suggesting that we should be taking this output from the committee, this clarity, and putting it on a statutory basis, given the Herculean task that would involve, given all the case law that's already there, the common law, and the statutory provisions that already exist? It would be a non-trivial undertaking, but is that your view?
Well, certainly it's certainly the view of ShareAction that should be enshrined in legislation, and I wouldn't agree with this idea that it would be a really Herculean undertaking, because, as I say, the changes that we're proposing isn't a complete revolutionary overhaul of those fiduciary duties. It preserves those core elements that we've just been describing. We actually have a responsible investment bill where we've set out exactly how that would be achieved, and I think it could be achieved in a relatively straightforward and really prudent and cautious way. But ultimately, yes, that's certainly what we would advocate.
Is that a general view?
I think our view is, it's an excellent piece of work, but it's a lawyerly piece of work. It's like, if you want to do something, you ask a lawyer for advice and they give you 6 pages of text. You're not quite sure what you can do. So it needs the pensions regulator, DWP, to translate this immediately. This is an urgent issue, to translate it immediately into clearer guidance for trustees. And that will then give them the confidence to make the right kind of decisions without fear of legal challenge. We've got to expedite this. I think in the longer term, legal change might be necessary, but that we just need to move to immediate guidance, and they've given a fantastic basis for doing so. So we should expedite this.
I'd agree with Tony. I think this is a great document. It's a really good piece of work. The very first page makes clear this is not advice. This is the view of the Financial Markets Law Committee on fiduciary duties right now. So is it therefore something that a trustee could rely on in court if necessary? Is it something that a trustee could use to go back to their advisors and say, well, hang on, we've got this document, how do you work with that? What we want to see, exactly to Tony's point, is this being turned into guidance, interpreted by the pensions regulator, turned into guidance for trustees, and see how that beds in. I think at that point we'll have a clear understanding of whether this is sufficient to provide the guidance necessary, or whether there is still a range of various interpretations of fiduciary duties across the pension fund industry, and whether there might then after that be a need to consider, is the law drafted in the appropriate way.
Thank you very much indeed. Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask quite a straight question about whether the legal definition of fiduciary duties needed to be changed, but I think we've gone around that quite a few times, and my understanding is James, Charlotte and Tony are talking about interpretation and guidance and Companies Act's point. I saw that, but ShareAction are in a different place and would ask for a legal change now. Is that about right?
Yes.
I think.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
I didn't get to respond to, additionally to that, the FMRC paper I think is really important, but what I would highlight is the footnotes are almost as important as the main text. I would encourage everybody to look at that, particularly because it refers to things like double materiality, impact, universal ownership, particularly in footnote 38. Now that's particularly important because not all investment consultants and advisors are providing that advice. So we are making a massive assumption in terms of what's happening in the marketplace. The other thing is it does not point out the nuance between defined benefit schemes and defined contribution schemes. The reason why we need guidance now is because we've got plenty of mature defined benefit schemes going to buyout without asking these crucial questions about sustainability. And that's very, very concerning. So we do need more nuance in guidance that needs to come from TPR on sustainability in relation to different types of schemes and where they are in terms of their maturity.
I would also just say I think I certainly wouldn't overstate the difference. I think it's perhaps a difference of emphasis. I mean, you've all sort of alluded to the fact that there may need to be a change in the law. We would also welcome additional guidance to sort of enshrine and provide additional clarity over around some of these principles. I think, again, though, what we come back to is that has been tried before and it ultimately hasn't worked. Now, that's not to say there's not scope for additional clarification as well. But ultimately, I think that this amendment of the definition of best interests in the law on fiduciary duty would empower trustees to take this much wider view and give them the confidence that Tony has already alluded to as being absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much. And Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to spend a few minutes, if I may, to understand the economic models that are used by investment consultants to advise trustees. So I have experience of economic models, but in a health perspective. So first of all, could you explain a little bit more about the types of models that are used and what you believe are the issues within them, and who would like to kick off?
I mean, it seems everyone's looking at me. I think at basic level, the investment consultants, and you'll have to ask them more details about the models that they use, I think. But investment consultants, of course, are the industry exists to provide advice to trustees, and there is an awful lot of advice that trustees need to take because of and rightly so, because the weight of responsibility that they have over the retirement, the financial health in retirement of millions of people is an enormous responsibility, and right that they take guidance. I think one of the challenges for is when different models are being used, and we know that there are some models that say, that portfolios will only have a minimal impact if the world warms to 4 degrees and other things like this that are demonstrably untrue. But more in the mainstream, I think there is a challenge for trustees that they take guidance, and they then, of course, spend a lot of money taking guidance, receive that guidance. If they choose not to follow the guidance from their consultants, where does the liability sit for any concerns or any problems that arise as a result of doing so? So if something goes wrong and the pension fund trustees can argue that they took the best possible guidance, they followed that guidance, and still something went wrong, well, that's life. Things don't go to plan. If the pension fund trustees take guidance, choose not to follow that guidance for whatever reason, and then something goes wrong, well, then you have, of course, much more serious questions to ask of those trustees. And so given the range of different things that trustees need to consider, the inherent underlying human response is to take the guidance, even if you're not fully on board with it, or even if you think it doesn't fully incorporate all the factors and components that you think it should be including. You can ask lots of questions, of course, but you still feel somehow compelled to take that guidance. And that, I think, is one of the challenges here, that we have a small number of investment consulting firms that are providing an enormous range of advice and have, therefore, a huge power in the industry. And some think of the industry as a pyramid with the pension funds at the top because they hold the assets, and then they appoint asset managers to manage them. But actually, one might argue that above the pension fund trustees are the consultants, and the power that they hold over decision making, and therefore the interpretation that they take on a range of different factors, including fiduciary duties, including the long-term nature of pensions, including the impacts and economic impacts and models of future changes in the environment or other factors. They have a huge power in the system, and I think there is a very reasonable question to ask that the committee might wish to ask to the FCA and to the government around, given that outsized power that these consulting firms have, how are they being regulated, and what approach are they taking is the FCA and others taking to ensuring that advice follows some core regulatory principles?
So just to add, I very much agree with that. I think others in the next panel will probably know more detail about the design of those models, but having done a bit of economic modelling in the past myself, economists try to make assumptions that simplify things to allow some sort of calculation, and you end up with a number. Clearly, the advice that's been given has been completely erroneous to trustees. And you end up with trustees in that position of they can't disagree with it because they're worried about the threat of legal action. So that's extremely problematic. My understanding is those models don't take into account flooding. Do we think climate change is going to drive flooding across the globe? I think we know that. The impacts on food production across the world not taken into account. So these are economic models. They haven't consulted climate scientists with a specialism in understanding these changes. So they're really problematic. I really welcome, and you'll hear, I guess, from USS after this, but the approach to looking at more qualitative descriptions of what may happen that can then guide trustees. And again, the FMLC paper gives permission for trustees to consider that kind of approach as well in their decision making. But you do have, and I think, the Competition and Markets Authority looked at these companies in the past. You have a very closed group of companies, as James said, with a lot of power, a lot of influence, and you have low capacity trustees who are taking their advice. And I do think there is a need again to revisit with the FCA regulating them.
I think Charlotte was first, and then Lewis, if that's okay.
Yeah. So just on your specific point, I'm not going to go into the specifics of the economic models, but there definitely are issues with the scenario analysis that's being used. Some of that's to do with the types of inputs that are going in, whether they're using implied temperature metrics, whether they're using science-based targets, and there isn't necessarily consensus around that, which is why USS went to University of Exeter to look at what should be going into those models. What I would say is, even where we've got to now isn't an end state. This is still ongoing. We still don't have full Scope 3 emissions. So in terms of what we're covering, it still isn't the full picture. So that is going to be evolving. I have some empathy with the investment consultants in terms of what they're trying to achieve. But the investment consultants themselves set up a sustainability working group that they run and manage, which in and of itself is problematic. So who is having independent oversight of that? It's one of the reasons why we decided to look at fiduciary managers and investment consultants. Please have a look at the link in our written response, and actually demonstrated in that the discrepancy between those that are giving integrated advice on ESG and impact and those that aren't is quite wide. And that can't be the case where pension fund trustees are coming to rely on that. So I think something needs to be looked at. That's why I've pushed for the Companies Act change, because that applies to the whole chain.
Thank you. Lewis?
Thank you. I think it's a really important question, and I think I mentioned around the deficiencies in the climate scenario models earlier. Our written evidence sort of details a little bit of that and points towards the research, but the fundamental problem very often is that it prioritises or privileges a quantitative approach over a qualitative analysis. And I think what that boils down to is prioritising what can be measured, however imperfectly or uncertainly, over measuring what should be prioritised. Now, the FMLC report was very positive in this regard in terms of advocating a numbers and narrative approach, and I think that there was a lot to be said for that. I think it's a wider issue, though, than just in the climate models, which comes, and it also touches on the role of investment consultants in the system, which is that there is almost a risk aversion cubed built into the way that the pension investment system works. Now, it's right that obviously that they're prudent. We're talking about people's retirement income here, but it's not in the interest of members to be excessively risk averse. And I think that but again, bringing it back to this redefinition of the best interest of the beneficiaries by taking account of those wider impacts, it frees them up to take that wider, more nuanced and comprehensive view of how their investment strategy is actually serving those beneficiaries.
Very helpful, thank you. I have to say I'm absolutely staggered that it's a question of either qualitative or or quantitative evidence, and both aren't used. But I think from what you're saying, there are both issues in the design and the oversight of these models, the validation and so on, but also in terms of the capacity of trustees to be able to question them and their validity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just ask you on this? I mean, it does seem a strange situation if it is the case that schemes are working on the basis of economic models which suggest that a 4% increase in global temperature is kind of modest, whereas the scientists are telling us it's kind of beyond catastrophic. I mean, how do you think it is that such a divergence of view has arisen?
I think, sorry, just... Oh, do you want to go?
Well, what I understand, you'll hear from the next panel maybe in more depth, that the economic model is flawed. So its assumptions, looking at impact on global GDP at 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, is deeply flawed. I might be entirely wrong, but I think one of the assumptions is that the productive economy takes place within buildings. So, it doesn't take into account, as I said, flooding, droughts, mass migration. One of the real risks is that millions of people won't be able to live where they live now because the mix of heat and humidity will kill people, wet bulb temperature. So it doesn't take into account the mass migration that will be driven by extreme climate change. So it's just so flawed. But this was discovered through freedom of information requests to pension schemes to find out that this advice was being given. It's absolutely stunning. It's a travesty, absolute travesty. So it's incredibly, it's wonderful that it's been spotted, that you've got schemes like USS working with a university to try and look at, other sorts of approaches, and the modelling needs to get a lot better. And it also worries me that we have these net zero frameworks that schemes are using, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, the IIGCC. We've got agreed global frameworks. Are those good enough? Are those based on some of these kind of economic modelling scenarios that are really erroneous? So it's quite shocking that that's happened.
Thank you. Charlotte,
I just want to mention, I think one of the things that we need to take into account here, that we're using traditional economic models, we're using traditional modern portfolio theory. A lot of those things are being reviewed and being looked at in a completely different context. You just need to look at Kate Raworth's Donut Economics or look at Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory. The difficulty is that it's not well socialised. It is held up usually at an academic level, but it isn't then popularised among the investment community. Why is that? And I know I keep banging on about it, but it is because if companies, and all of the people we're talking about in terms of the actors are companies, are focused on short-term profit maximisation, what is the incentive to change structural models that they're using? So, it comes down to who plays the honest broker in this situation.
James,
I think a bit building on those things. I think the other component is the position of a pension fund in the economy. I think I said it earlier. The pension fund cannot insulate itself from what happens to the economy. It can't move its investments around in such a way that what happens in the economy doesn't have a material effect on the pension fund itself. And so I think a core part of the consideration of the pension fund must be what happens in the wider economy, and therefore must be the pension fund potentially trying to look at the way that it has a role in first of all understanding what might happen in the wider economy and potentially trying to influence that too.
Thank you. And just on coming back to Lewis, you've been clearest on the panel in calling for a change in the law, and I think the change you wanted was that schemes should take account of the impact of the investments. And did you say that you have a draft bill which would do that?
We do. So I'm not speaking as a lawyer, but we have consulted with lawyers quite extensively. We had a responsible investment bill in late 2020 which set out in detail how the kind of principles that I've spoken about could be enshrined in legislation.
The thing I just wanted to ask you is the impact that you're envisaging they should be focused on the impact on, is it the financial impact on the scheme that we're talking about, or is it a sort of impact on the world in some...
Well, I think it's the impact on the beneficiaries rather than the impact on the world outside, sort of in a nebulous, abstract way.
Financial impact on the beneficiaries?
I think it's certainly primarily sort of financial, but actually looking at the wider environmental and social impacts of a scheme's investments and the impacts that they may have on their beneficiaries. We know from, and again our written evidence sort of alludes to this, that the members want the way that their money is invested to be done in a way that aligns with their long-term interests and with their values. That is an important other aspect of our responsible investment bill, was actually a duty to understand the priorities of beneficiaries so that that can be integrated into the investment strategy. Now, that is not to say that the discretion would be kind of delegated to the members. That's not what we advocate at all. I think that would be a dereliction of fiduciary duty, and that it is ultimately up to the trustees to make those judgments. But it's this inside-out approach in addition to the outside-in approach that I think is really, really fundamental. So understanding the impacts that the scheme has on wider factors.
Can I just build on that, just to help a little bit? So I'm not sure if the committee's aware of UK SDR, the Sustainable Disclosure Regime. But that means that effectively asset managers can decide to launch funds that are trying to have particular impact goals. That means only some of the funds that they will offer will have that impact baked in. Now, our view, and building on Lewis' view, is that the impact that you have through an investment on the world is financially material in the same way that what happens to the world is material to the company, needs to be factored into every investment. Now, we recognise that's difficult, but we can't have a situation where only some funds have that built in, or only some investment opportunities have that built in. We do have to get to a situation where that is recognised in the system.
Well, I can see that looking at the financial impact, it's probably a sort of doable thing. The very wide kind of impact that you're describing sounds to me as quite a difficult thing to implement in law or in practice.
I think I don't think it would be difficult to implement, because you're preserving the discretion of the trustee, and they're already expected to balance different factors in their investment strategy, and they're not always immediately quantifiable. So, I mean, as Charlotte has said, like ultimately, I think that so many of these factors are ultimately financially material. But by sort of myopically looking at it only through that lens, it does not equip trustees with the decision-making capabilities that they need to be able to act in those longer-term best interests. And as you've said, that needs to be a systemic approach. It cannot be restricted to particular sort of designated funds. It needs to be part of the default fund strategy that accounts for preserving the need to act in the financial best interests of beneficiaries, takes into account all of these wider environmental, and we've spoken about climate change, and that's the focus here today, but social factors enter into that as well. And I think that is the proper role of a pension trustee in meeting the interests of a member.
Thank you, and thank you all very much for giving us very interesting answers to our questions. We're grateful to you all. And we'd ask now if you please step down from the table and our second panel to come forward. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order, and welcome everybody to this meeting of the Working Pensions Select Committee considering the fiduciary duties of pension fund trustees. We're grateful to the members of the second panel who've now joined us. Can I ask you each to tell us very briefly who you are, starting with Nigel Peaple.
Hello, yes, I'm Nigel Peaple. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association, which basically represents workplace pensions, and the schemes in our membership run about $1.25 trillion of assets, and there are about 30 million members in those schemes.
Thank you. Carol Young.
Hi, I'm Carol Young. I'm the Group Chief Executive of the University's Superannuation scheme, and one of the largest private pension schemes in the UK and one of the very few remaining open defined benefit schemes. That does mean that we are a very long-term investor, and we can and have for some time taken a long-term view, and as part of that viewed climate change as a relevant financial factor.
Thank you. Debbie Webb.
Hi, so Debbie Webb. I am the Chair of the Pensions Board at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and that's who I'm representing today. My day job is as a scheme actuary at WTW, where I do a lot of work with large pension schemes.
Thank you. And Rachel Croft.
Hello, I'm Rachel Croft. I'm a member of the Council of the Association of Professional Pension Trustees, and it's in that capacity that I'm here today. My day job is a professional trustee for at Independent Governance Group.
Thank you all very much for joining us. Can I put then the first question to you? You heard the first panel telling us that the way trustees understand their fiduciary duties means they can't take sufficient account at the moment of the dangers of climate change in their investment decisions. I'd be very interested to hear from each of you how far you agree with that concern. Nigel Peaple.
Yes, well, talking with our members, we don't have that impression. We feel the fiduciary duty definitely does allow pension schemes to take account of climate change challenges. And I think the FMLC report that's come out rather underlines that point by emphasising how so many of those climate change issues are actually financial factors.
Carol Young.
We have not seen fiduciary duty as a barrier to being able to think about climate change as a relevant financial factor. I do think that one of the things that's been drawn out here is that trustees and fiduciaries that have the relevant size, scale and skills are able to do that effectively, and we've found that that is something that we have been able to do. And indeed, I think I'd go a bit further and say that we would harbour a concern that if fiduciary duty were to be changed or amended or a parallel duty introduced, that it might confuse more than it would clarify.
But just picking up your point about the scale, do you think there perhaps is a problem for funds that don't have the resources that you have at your disposal? Perhaps because you can, I know you've worked with universities on this, you can do your own modelling and research and so on, and others who are using investment consultants' models may not be able to do that. Is there a difference there?
Look, I think there is a duty on anyone who becomes a trustee and takes on a fiduciary duty to make sure that they're properly resourced and that they're able to challenge their investment consultants. That's at the heart of that duty. I can't speak for all schemes, but I would say that it definitely does require a level of resource and skill to be able to address this properly, because it is complicated.
Thank you.
But if you have those things, you can address it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think in talking about fiduciary duty and what schemes are doing, it's actually helpful to unpack a little what we're trying to get schemes to do, and that there are almost three levels. I think the Freshfields Investing for Impact report from 2021 was very useful in setting out three different levels of investing for sustainability. The first financial level is simply taking account of financial factors of risks and returns on sustainability when you're making investment decisions. And I think most schemes understand that, most schemes do that. At that very basic level, it happens. The second level is about what they called instrumental investing, which is actually investing in order to have a positive impact on sustainability going forward, on climate change going forward, but in pursuit of your financial aims. So if it's going to help your overall financial aims, then you can invest sustainably and for impact. And I think the sort of things USS are doing very much fall within that. What the Financial Law Report very much supported is being able to quite broadly consider that in terms of how you invest. There is a third level, and that level they called ultimate ends investing. That's where you actually invest for impact on climate change as a goal in itself. And that is, it needs to be a secondary goal because the primary purpose of the trust is still to meet the benefits of the members, and that must be the primary purpose. But to have as a sort of secondary motive, a secondary purpose, impact on climate change happening as an end in itself. And I think that bit I don't think is currently permitted under fiduciary duty. I think there's a debate about whether it should be. But if it's felt that it should be, there would need to be regulatory change to affect that.
Thank you. Rachel Croft.
In our experience, there is nothing within the current definition of fiduciary duty that prevents trustees from taking into account climate change considerations and climate risk. It comes back to the core of trustees' duties, which are to protect the financial outcomes of members of the pension schemes, and in doing so, we must inevitably take into account all risks that might prevent us from achieving those objectives, and climate risk clearly is one of those risks. Different schemes will have different sensitivities to climate risk. So, for example, large open schemes will have longer time horizons and therefore greater sensitivity to climate risk. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, smaller schemes, closed schemes, which may be perhaps in the defined benefit area, be looking to buy out their benefits within a short time horizon, will have less sensitivity perhaps to climate risk. We welcome also the FMLC report in its clarity on achieving a balance between recognising trustees' fiduciary duty and clarifying the difference between financial and non-financial factors that should be taken into account.
Elaine Saxby.
Thank you and good morning. One of the aims of the mandatory task force for climate-related financial disclosures reporting was to encourage trustees to think more thoroughly about the risks and opportunities of the transition to low-carbon economy. How effective do you think this reporting has been? Rachel, did you want to go first?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. So the first thing to say, and I think it was mentioned on the first panel, this is early days in this regime. So the largest schemes will have carried out 2 or be in the process of carrying out their second round of reporting. The next rung down will have done 1. And some schemes, those with assets less than 1 billion, which are not DC master trusts, will not be under the regime at all currently. It's fair to say it's a complex area and there's been a high degree of learning that's been needed amongst the trustee community and the advisors. But it's fair to say I think that trustees have taken this very seriously. They have taken steps to undertake training in order to understand the requirements and be able to test and challenge their advisors. Where I think the regime does need a bit more work is, as some of the members of panel 1 mentioned, in the accuracy and reliability of some of the data and the modelling that underlies some of that reporting. But as trustees, we recognise that it's a moving area, an evolving area, and that it's incumbent on us to stay up to speed, keep abreast of developments, and approach it with that in mind.
Thank you. You're nodding along, Debbie. Is there anything anyone else wants to add from the panel?
No, I think it really has increased the time that trustees are spending on these issues. It has increased the focus, and in that sense, it's been very successful. I do think that perhaps some of that time has, particularly in the first stage of the first reports, been spent thinking about the process of getting to the report and the reporting and the disclosure side of it, rather than the inherent sort of climate policy and how to affect change. I do think as we move on, and as the schemes already have the format of the report, they kind of know what they're doing better, that shift to thinking more about the actual investment side will happen as we go through the next iteration.
Thank you.
So I broadly agree, and I won't overlabour those points. I think it's helped move us on. I think it's very important, though, that it doesn't become too prescriptive or burdensome, because what we really need is action, not further and more detailed reporting. The thing I would pull out is that one of the things it does encourage is thinking about scenario analysis, and as the previous panel mentioned, one of the things that we voluntarily disclosed since 2018, and we've made 2 formal disclosures. But one of the things that led us to do was to work with the University of Exeter to think about how we could develop climate scenario analysis that was decision useful. And we think that's been a really distinctive contribution. We've made it publicly available because we want to see this change, and we think transition's a team sport. And we're continuing to work on how can we take these shorter term scenarios which take sort of numbers and narrative, look more broadly than the climate pathway work does, to help trustees to factor that into their thinking. And so when we're thinking about how we maybe want to bridge this gap of how do people who have a shorter investment horizon think about these things, we're hopeful that that's a helpful contribution to that, and we're now turning our attention to thinking about transition and physical risks as well and factoring that in. So I think there's definitely a way that it can be done within current fiduciary duty, and I think to your original question, TCFD has helped, but now we need to focus on action, not more burdensome reporting.
Just to build on that slightly, we surveyed our members just over a year ago and said, do you think TCFD reporting has helped you focus on climate change issues? And half said, yes, it had helped them. And the other half said, not really, because we were already focusing on it. But I do think an interesting point here is about the regime that applies. TCFD reporting, as you know, was brought in first for occupational pension schemes and then later for companies. And that tends to mean that the data that is supplied via asset managers and advisors to pension trustees as they're trying to make their decisions about TCFD is not always, well, it's not as good as we would all like, so there's a data issue there. And then finally, on the regulatory side, the local government pension scheme, which is, the largest pension scheme in the country, does a great deal in this area, and there's many fine examples of them being really engaged with dealing with sustainability issues. They do not yet actually have a requirement on them for TCFD reporting. And that seems to be a government regulation issue. It's always being delayed. It's always being promised.
And are there any other specific challenges that schemes have experienced with regards to the TFCD reporting that any of you would like to highlight and put on the record this morning?
I think, as I already mentioned, in this, as it's early days, and in this first and second rounds, concerns about the accuracy and reliability of the data in some cases, and any move towards standardising that data, I think, would be welcomed by trustees.
Thank you. Any others?
Really, if I may, just really to emphasise how we're at such an early stage of understanding climate change. Business and society is at such an early stage of understanding their impacts. So the data that's coming up and the models, fair point earlier, the models are not yet perfected, the data's not yet perfected. So it's early days still.
And is there a risk, do you think, of it becoming a tick-box exercise?
There's a risk of it taking all of the governance time available to think about this topic if it's not right-sized. And, I think everyone has agreed thus far that trustees have a lot of things to consider and a lot of things to manage. And I think what you want is something that facilitates trustees being able to factor this into their broader decision-making. So to the extent to which we can be freed up to do that, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Celine. Nigel, your point about local government, do you think the same obligation should be imposed on the local government scheme?
Absolutely, and also the people who run that scheme feel that as well. It helps to have a harmonised approach across society and in terms of reporting.
Okay, thank you. Sir Desmond Swain.
Notwithstanding Rachel's very forthright statement to the contrary, are there areas where trustees' fiduciary duty with respect to climate change are unclear?
Would you like me to start?
You do.
Unsurprisingly, no, I don't think they are unclear. I think the lawyers will give you an answer on what constitutes trustee duty, which will cover a long period of legislation and case law. I think for trustees, in a practical sense, it's very straightforward. We're there to act in the best interest of the members of the scheme, and that means their financial interests. As I said, I think the FMLC guidance then clarifies further that what are financial factors and non-financial factors, and in particular that the climate risks that we've been discussing have become financial factors. And that makes it very clear for trustees in carrying out their duties to take into account very seriously climate-related risk.
I think I would agree with that. As I said before, I think that particularly with the Financial Market Law Report clarifications, they have made it clear that the first two levels I was talking about of investment are very much something trustees can and should be doing as part of their fiduciary duties, which are, just to be clear, I would phrase fiduciary duty as the responsibility of the trustees to fulfill the purpose of the trust. And the purpose of the trust is to make sure the members get their benefits as specified and as they fall due. I think reinterpreting it as member interest is not quite what it is, so just to be clear about that. But then getting back to climate change and fiduciary duty, I think that the Financial Markets Law Report is particularly helpful in describing how wide financial factors are, that they talk about it at individual investment level, they talk about it at portfolio level, and they also talk about investment in the sense of what it's going to do to the financial markets you will be investing in over the lifetime of your membership. And particularly that third one does make it into quite a broad factor when it comes to looking at financial markets. And they also make it clear that, as Carol said, it's numbers and narrative, that it's not just about what you can quantify, that in making those decisions you can use qualitative narrative to do that. And I think that all means it does become clear what the fiduciary duty is and how much trustees can take it into account.
Do trustees take an insufficiently long-term view when considering investment risks? And do some of them take too narrow a view as to the potential risks of a particular investment? Anyone?
Well, maybe let me take a bit of the previous question and that question together then. So I think that actually fiduciary duty in the law is really pretty clear, and I think that the FMLC's contribution to that debate has been really helpful and would align with our views. I think where some clarity might be welcome in terms of broader discourse, and it maybe comes into some of this, is firstly that it is open to trustees to take climate change into account as a relevant financial factor. But one of the things fundamental about fiduciary duty, and that I think sometimes gets lost in some of these discussions, is that trustees and fiduciaries are what we describe in law as principals, not agents. It is not their job to harvest in the views of members and to execute that in investment policy. It is their job to invest the assets of the trust in line with the purpose of the trust. And so I think that if you can give trustees some confidence that they won't be subject to hindsight or meritless legal claims around individual members' personal preferences, that provided they have operated with the right skills, the right advice and the right process, then I think they could have some additional confidence to think more widely and to take action. But currently, you are seeing fiduciaries here and abroad simultaneously facing litigation for doing too much and doing too little on climate change. And I think that shows that the bind that fiduciaries face, it is not possible to gather and execute the shared view of 500,000 people, as is the case in our scheme. And so what trustees need is confidence that they can take this into account. And I think if you were to clarify or give weight to the FMLC's findings, which I think make that quite clear and make it clear that that's how the law stands, I think you would open the door to trustees to be able to act with greater confidence.
Can I just express my agreement with the value of having further guidance? I know when PLSA has put forward examples from our larger pension schemes, case studies of how they do net zero investing, it's always very popular. And on this kind of point generally about fiduciary duty, I don't think there's much data down at the detailed level about problems that might be experienced. But what we have found when we talked to our members about this was they said there was actually a fairly limited number of specialist lawyers in this space. There's a call for more climate change lawyers.
Oh, right, more lawyers. The association, so whilst we're on lawyers, the Association of Pension Lawyers, as I've said earlier, have suggested that everything is absolutely clear. The complexity arises when you try and push something with a quite different ultimate objective into the mix. So are you agreed that ultimately trustees must always take decisions in the best financial interests of the scheme beneficiaries? And are there circumstances in which fiduciary duties might legitimately conflict with mitigating climate change risks? And if they do, what do we do about it?
I think that is a clear view from the Association of Pension Lawyers, and it comes through also in the FMLC report, and it is in keeping with how trustees typically understand their duties. Where, as you say, tension may arise is where there might be pressure otherwise for trustees to make a decision that would worsen the security of members' benefits in a defined benefit scheme in favour of taking action on climate, for example, or to take a decision not to enter into a buyout if that was their preferred end game for the scheme, again in favour of taking action on climate.
Just to say, we very much agree with the APL position on that. It is about purpose, and I think we're clear that provided you're taking the financial interests and the long-term view into account, you can do it. If government decided they wanted pension schemes to go beyond that and to invest for the specific purpose of impacting climate change as a secondary objective, you would need to change the regulations in order to permit that.
So I would say that I absolutely agree that the primary purpose of the fiduciary is to invest in the best financial interests of the beneficiaries. We're a large universal owner, though, with a very long-term time horizon, and so we also accept that we can't cherry-pick or invest our way around these issues. So we do see them as relevant financial factors, and we do see them as relevant financial factors not just in the long term, but as the modelling we've done with Exeter and the other work that we've done shows, as things that you can begin to translate into decision useful scenarios that you can take into account in the shorter term. I don't think you need to change fiduciary duty to allow us to do that. And indeed, where would it end? Because there's nature, there's antimicrobial resistance.
Well,
you have to allow fiduciaries, frankly, to do their thing and make sure they're appropriately skilled and resourced to do that effectively.
Maybe just try to add to this a little bit. So I think it's absolutely clearly the case that any pension fund with a reasonably long time horizon will need to take account of climate change issues. It is true that some closed DB schemes where they've only got a small number of years to buy out, I think in some circumstances, some of them may be thinking that these climate change investment issues aren't directly relevant to them. Now, however, TPR has produced a blog last summer emphasising that even those schemes with a very short time horizon should be thinking hard about the climate change implications of their investment portfolio, which often will be government bonds, of course, at that point. But I also think it's important for the committee to think about and what happens after these closed DB schemes go and get buyout with an insurer. What is the what is the investment mix being run by buyout companies as well? Because that will be where the assets sit for much, much longer.
Does the FMLC report disappoint in any way? Does it leave anything unresolved?
I think the FMLC report provides great clarity on the definition of fiduciary duty and that balance between acting in members' best financial interests and taking into account the very serious and real risks presented by climate change. What could be done in addition, I think, is to consider enshrining some or all of that report into guidance. In the first panel, there was more talk about changing the law, and I've already expressed some concerns about changing fiduciary duty itself. But actually, enshrining some of that guidance into that report into guidance with some practical examples would be a very real life way of helping trustees to encapsulate it without going to the trouble of changing the law.
So, are you collectively of that view that? To take the output and have the TPR put it into guidance is all we need to do, or is there a question of making this statutory? Are you happy with guidance, or should we make it law as well?
I'm happy with guidance. I would have a strong preference for that over changes to law. I do think it's a helpful contribution to the debate. It's not all we need to do, though. I mean, I think that is the key point, is we can't pin too much on a single report or a single pension scheme, or indeed pension schemes as a whole, to make the kind of real-world change we need to make. Pension schemes can play a part within a broader system, but if governments and regulators believe that climate change is an important factor, then it needs to be addressed at the system level and let pensions be part of that system.
Can I chip in? So I also agree guidance would do a very good job. It would make sense for TPR to consider the FMLC guidance and make sure that it's sort of accessible and useful for pension schemes, but a really good thing and enough. Better than changing law where you might get all sorts of unintended consequences. But just picking up Carol's points though about the wider picture, which we haven't really talked about, is, you know, the UK doesn't yet have a transition plan to net zero. If we had one, that would be much easier for pension funds to be able to work out, well, which investments are going to be climate aware and help to achieve net zero. We don't yet have a green taxonomy, which is, you know, which assets are green. We don't yet have a green taxonomy. And also something that comes up many times and has come up from many others, is the lack of investment opportunities in green things and lack of government action. So if government was working with industry with a clear idea about how to achieve a green economy, it would be much easier for pension funds to invest in a way that helps achieve net zero.
I blame Labour.
Nigel, can I just pick up your point about the insurers, in quite a lot of cases, will be managing these assets in the future as a result of buyout? Just remind us what the regulatory framework for insurers is in this area. Are there constraints and...
So I'm not an expert on the insurance regime for insurers, but what I do believe they are under TCFD requirements, and they're now going to be under the FCA SDR requirements. So they have disclosure requirements. But beyond that, I'm not an expert. Right. I don't know if anyone else on the panel is.
Well, that's something for us to look at separately, perhaps. Thank you very much. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Steve. And good morning, everyone. You probably heard my question to the previous panel about the validity of the economic models that are used by investment consultants, particularly in relation to climate change and the incorporation of that in investment decisions. I just wondered if you agreed with their overall comments.
I'll start just talking about, so the IFOA, in conjunction with the University of Exeter, did recently produce a report on this issue, and the conclusions of that were that there was a bit of a disconnect between climate science and some of the economic models currently being used, and this currently being used, just to be clear, for TCFD reporting, so in the ways that the schemes were reporting. The economic models were developed, I think probably the first thing to say is this stuff is hard. It's complex to model. It's a very new science in terms of things, so we're all developing and learning as we go. The initial economic models which were developed to do this did have limitations. I think that was economists trying to make robust models and trying to make sure each assumption was carefully justified. It meant that they put constraints on the models that have meant that when it comes to actually running them through, and particularly when it comes to looking at the downside scenarios, that they've potentially understated the impact. So the models try to model what they call the hothouse effect, which is where we get to 3 or 4% global warming, and the IFOA and universities' findings were that those did tend to, and sometimes quite materially, understate the financial impacts of those scenarios. So yes, there is an issue there. The IFOA report suggests 3 areas where things can improve on this. The one, and this to me is Actuarial Science 101, understand the limitations of the models, make sure when you are talking to people about using the models that they understand the limitations, they understand what they are doing and what they aren't doing. The second, which Carol has already alluded to, is absolutely about using qualitative analysis and scenario analysis to supplement the quantitative analysis. And the third, which clearly we at the IFOA and others are working on hard, is just to help make the models better and to expand them and to make them more sophisticated and to make them a better reflection of what we think the real world impacts will be.
Thank you. Carol, and before I do this, I should say that I am a former USS member, so I need to declare that. But I wondered if you wanted to, if you wanted to
comment. So in terms of the commentary on broader investment consultants, I haven't looked at that in depth, but I have always found the investment consultants that I have worked with externally to be professional and thoughtful. And so some of this may well come about from the fact that this is indeed difficult and emerging work. In the current scheme USS, the majority of our investment advice is provided by our in-house providers, supplemented by working with external experts, including the University of Exeter. And one of the things we found was that the models that were being used when we looked to do our climate scenario analysis, they mapped out long-term climate pathways, but they tended to look at climate risk in isolation, and they tended to make smoothing assumptions. And we concluded that that wasn't particularly decision useful. And so the work that we undertook with Exeter and that we made available tried to look at sort of 5 to 10 year time horizons. It tried to capture some of the knock-on effects like mass migration and instability, and then it generated 4 scenarios that we think better reflected real world risks and opportunities, that go from the sort of optimistic, where politics, economics and markets work together, through to the far less optimistic, where there's toxic political debate and market dysfunction, and that frustrates progress. And we wanted to do that and to make that available so that people can start to factor that into their decision making. So as I said before, we think it's a distinctive contribution. We're now working through the very difficult work, actually, which is why you do need to be skilled and resourced to do it, of trying to embed that into our financial decision making, our expectations, our portfolio management. It can be done. And as I alluded to, we're now also beginning to think more about how we allow for physical risk within that. So I think what you find is a very complex issue, a very live issue, and the modelling and lots of well-motivated people working to keep up. And so it definitely does require trustees with sufficient skill to be able to interpret that and to be able to work with, and where appropriate, challenge their consultants. I've always been in large, well-resourced schemes where that's not been a problem. I can't comment about whether it's a problem more broadly.
So on that, I'm very interested to understand the process. So clearly you looked at the models and you said these aren't good enough. And to understand the process...
He didn't give us everything we needed, certainly. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and you said, right, we need to do something about this, and you've developed your own model. How did you get to the process to decide that the models you were provided with weren't adequate enough?
Well, I think I already mentioned that we had been voluntarily looking at TCFD disclosure since 2018. We'd been thinking about how to integrate it, and it's probably underpinned with the fact that we are a large scheme and a universal owner, and so we had long ago concluded that we couldn't go around these issues, and therefore we had to engage with them and understand what impact they would have on the portfolio.
Was that all trustees that you had a board decision? Was it one trustee? How did it actually happen that you came to that conclusion? Was it brought to your attention by different consultants who advised you? What was the decision making that made USS specifically come to that view? This isn't a good enough model.
So the first thing I should say is I've been here 6 months, so I wasn't around for all of that. But I have had the opportunity to, obviously I was well briefed when I came in, and I have had the opportunity to see the current trustee board in action. And I would say that it is... There are probably, in every trustee board, they bring a balance of skills, and some people have more skills and interest in a particular topic. We have world-class economists on our trustee board, for example. We have people who were heavily embedded in TCFD. But I think the more relevant point I would say for the committee is that what we have, and I can see we've always had, is cognitive diversity and a culture of challenge, debate, and working with our advisors to really understand what we're being told. So they are, I can't give you the historic sort of how it came about, but I can, I think, with some confidence say the factors that I think underpinned it.
Yeah. So in terms of the previous panel's view around capacity within the boards, that's very important. Obviously, you said you've got a very
I mean, I think it's a long-standing regulatory agenda that I would wholeheartedly support, which is around having schemes of sufficient size and scale with the right skills to be able to tackle the true complexity of what it takes to be an effective fiduciary.
That's I mean, if I could just expand a little about which schemes and when the models matter, because I think when you're USS and you're doing your own investments, it's absolutely critical you have the right models to make the decisions on the actual investments. Most trustees we're working with are delegating that day-to-day investment management to a third party. They don't actually need to have the sophisticated models that help to determine what the right individual investments are. They need to understand enough to give policy direction and to give guidance and to agree with those investment managers what the key strategic aims are. And it's actually those investment managers who need to have the models and the more sophisticated ways of looking at the investments. So I guess what I'm saying is, and they potentially do have the capacity to do that. So it's not that every scheme, you know, no matter how small, needs to be able to use sophisticated models. That's actually not decision useful to them. They need to understand the high level to set their strategy and to make sure that they've got the right investment managers doing the right job.
The trustees need to be able to ask the right questions.
They need
to be able to have confidence in those.
That's why we made our scenario work available. You know, I said already it's a team sport. I think there's more of this work needs to be done and put into the sort of system at large, so that not everybody has to undertake what we chose to undertake, but can instead build on that.
Absolutely. I'm conscious two people haven't answered.
Just to add, from a professional trustee perspective, of course, we welcome the work done by USS and the collaborative nature in which they've presented it and shared it. It will no doubt be very helpful to a lot of schemes, so thank you. I'd also echo the comments made by Debbie. Not every scheme clearly is a USS. There are a handful of schemes that have that size and that in-house investment management capability. But what professional trustees bring to schemes is obviously seeing the full range of different sizes and schemes and different investment consultants, and bringing that skill set to be able to, as you say, critically challenge what is in front of them. Whether that's a scheme that is subject to TCFD reporting, and even schemes that are not yet subject to any reporting.
Lovely, thank you.
My comments really just to build on those actually around the capability of trustees, because it clearly is very important. And we think there's a role here for TPR. We've said before they should have a register of trustees. When you've got a register of trustees, then you can build out from that and work out people's knowledge and capability and skills, which is so important.
Fantastic, thank you everyone.
Picking up your point there, Nigel, is there a wider role for the pensions regulator in this area? Carol, I mean, given what you're doing, should the pensions regulator be encouraging schemes to do what you're doing or supporting you in some way?
So, more guidance from the regulator, good. There is also the issue about the regulation of investment consultants, which was raised before. We have thought for some time they should come within the FCA remit in order to have those kind of key principles of practice to make sure the standards are high and up to date. I'm sure often they are, and I think we have heard about how everything's developing and new and it's at the frontier of knowledge, but nevertheless it's really important the higher standards are applied.
I mean, I think it's the TPR has already sought to clarify some of these matters. As we've all said, I think anything that gives a bit of weight and support to the findings of the FMLC would be welcome. It's the same sort of tension that we talked about in TCFD and other things, though. One of the beauties of fiduciary duty actually is it's quite elegant in that it's broad, and then it allows for suitably skilled people to make the right decisions with the right skills. And I think we would want still sort of legislative guidance that allows suitably skilled trustees to apply it to their schemes rather than anything that becomes too terribly prescriptive. I think that's difficult for everyone, the regulator included.
Thank you. Sean Bailey.
I think my question's been answered. It was about sort of what's had the greatest impact on decision making, which I think you've been kind of talking through at length as chair.
Well, can I just ask a question slightly related to this? If the law was changed, or someone was to propose the law was changed in the way that was suggested in our earlier panel by ShareAction, what problems do you think that might cause? I mean, I think you've made it clear that you're not seeking such a change, but if there was a change, would that be problematic, or or not?
It would be, because we the whole industry, you'd have to go through the whole business of trying to work out, well, how to interpret it and how to apply it. And we've already seen how knowledge has been deepening and growing and spreading, as we've been describing. If you were to kind of go in left field with a completely different approach, I'm sure it would slow down activity, apart from the bigger risk, I suppose, just to the fact that people won't have their pensions paid because there will have been investments made that are not financially suitable.
I mean, I already said I think any change or any addition to the statute book, I think, has to earn its place, and you need to be reasonably comfortable that it will clarify more than it will confuse. And my concern is that it would confuse more than it would clarify. Obviously, I come at that from a stance which is that I don't think that there's a huge problem to be solved with fiduciary duty itself. So I fear that it would probably take agenda time and thought from trustees as to whether it changed the nature of what they were able to do. And I think you could empower and give confidence to trustees far more effectively by adopting and giving some additional weight to the FMLC's findings such that they could act with confidence, and in particular be confident that they wouldn't be subject to, swathes of litigation provided they had followed proper purpose. I think that would be a great risk if we introduced competing priorities.
And I also just think there's a great risk of unintended consequences. I mean, the whole fiduciary risk framework is very well understood, and I would argue has worked very successfully for pension schemes for a long time. As was pointed out at the previous panel, it's complex. It's not in one place in law. It's a combination of law and a lot of case law over time. It's well understood. I think it's a concept which works and should continue to work, and making broad changes to that really does risk trustees having to take it into account in unexpected ways, or where it could bring into tension this new duty and their primary function of making sure that people get their pensions, which is what we're really doing. So we would not favour any changes to broad fiduciary duty. I think if anything was to be considered at all, it should be narrow. It should be about investment decision making. It should be about the current investment regulations for pension schemes, and it should just be permissive to make it very clear that these climate change or sustainability factors are relevant factors that trustees can take into account. Something permissive and explicit that was done explicitly about investment decision making and explicitly within the investment regulations of pension schemes might be a place you could encourage this change, but that would be as wide as we would want it to go.
And likewise, as I think I've already said, we think that the fiduciary duty for trustees is very clear and already not just permits them but requires them to take into account very seriously all risks that could prevent them from achieving their objectives of providing the best financial outcomes of members, including the risks relating to climate. And to attempt to change that would cause some of the difficulties that the other panellists have already mentioned, and in particular a tension may be that trustees would be faced with a decision to worsen the security of members' benefits in a defined benefit scheme, for example, in favour of making a more climate-friendly investment, or to decide not to transact a buyout for the same reason, which would not be in the best financial interest of the members of a scheme.
Can I just raise one or two other things? Carol, a couple of times you talked about addressing this at the system level. Can you just tell us a bit more what you envisage there, or what would make that happen?
So my point there was that if there is a view, and it's a view that we would share, that there's more to be done to affect real world change, there are probably more direct ways that governments and regulators could do that than placing an additional duty on fiduciaries. So anything that promotes the ability within the UK, for example, for people to take more personal steps, so improvements in the grid such that we can get better electrification. So my point was more that if you want to make this change, pension schemes are a part of the change, but we can't make the change alone. If the world needs to transition, we believe it does, and we would love to see regulators and governments taking action that makes that happen more broadly, rather than thinking that it can be solved through an additional duty on pension schemes.
There was a suggestion in the first panel that the Company Act should be changed. Is that the sort of change that you've got in mind, or?
Look, I'm not deeply steeped in that, so it's a bit of a drive-by observation. It potentially would introduce some of the same challenges that you see if you change fiduciary duty. But I think it's more about, if we believe these things are important, we can require data to be shared on it. We can put regulations in place that make transition front and centre of the government's agenda. We can price externalities properly. I'm not sure that a change to the Companies Act would be the right way to do that, but honesty dictates. I say I haven't given it an awful lot of thought, that specific point.
Okay. Two other things I'd just like to raise, if I may, on rather different subjects. One of them is that it's reported last night by Bloomberg that the Chancellor is considering options to increase pension fund investment in UK assets, apparently including setting a threshold for this, maybe requiring pension funds to disclose their allocations to different UK asset classes, launching an independent review to determine appropriate threshold of UK asset allocation for pension pots. What's your, Carol and Nigel, but maybe others as well, what would be your reaction if that is indeed in the Chancellor's mind at the moment?
Okay, so the PLSA has done some work over the last year or so thinking about how to make investment in the UK more attractive to pension funds. And we thought about it in terms of a whole series of things. Different things for DB, DC, changes to regulation, ideally changes maybe to fiscal incentives. On the other hand, we have always favoured the continuation of the ability of the trustees to have freedom of investment, to not interfere with the fiduciary duty, and therefore not to set quotas. It sounds, and I haven't seen the Bloomberg report, it sounds to me like they are not thinking of setting quotas there, but are thinking about providing maybe greater transparency of how much assets go to UK investments, which is fine. And it also sounds to me like they might be thinking in terms of having a sort of a target. Well, there's already the Mansion House Compact, which is a voluntary initiative, as you know, by some of the largest DC pension funds to aim to invest in unlisted equity and other certain asset classes. So I think provided it's not a mandatory target and provided it's on disclosure, it's fine. But we actually think the better thing would be changing the regime more generally to be attractive. And just briefly on that, so DB funding, we talked about that. We talked about having more flexibility in the funding code, which is something that perhaps we'll go on to. In the DC area, we've talked about the importance of bringing forward the value for money regime, so investments are not always done as cheap as possible, but they're more focused around performance. Fiscal incentives, we've said, why couldn't the UK do like some other countries and have fiscal incentives for investing in UK companies? So there's lots of things to do in that space. I haven't seen the Bloomberg report.
I have seen the report. If it's disclosure only, then we already disclose our UK holdings. We have significant UK infrastructure assets, and if the aim is to disclose, then that wouldn't be a problem. If the aim is to mandate, I agree that would be very problematic and would cut across fiduciary duty. If the aim is to make the UK attractive to investment, then I think we would support any action that increases the range of attractive investments, and so that would be the best way to tackle that, I think, is to make the UK a more attractive place to invest rather than mandate.
But you wouldn't be keen on a threshold for UK asset allocation for pension pots, whatever that might mean?
Well, I mean, it depends where they put it, and it depends if it was in line with Mansion House, if it was a minimum level of UK investment, then I would imagine we probably would meet it right now. But on first principles, I would object to the idea of there being mandated thresholds, because trustees have a significant amount of responsibility, and therefore they have to have the rights to go with that. And one of those rights is the ability to set the investment strategy that they think is appropriate.
And I would worry if it cut across asset class decisions,
yes.
So that the types of assets in which schemes invest, because that would be going quite a long way to fettering fiduciaries' duties to be able to invest as they see right. I mean, lots of schemes hold a lot of UK gilts, So if the measure was simply, do you hold UK assets, mature pension schemes would have no problem at all given their gilt holdings. It wouldn't actually have the impact. But to go and say they have to hold growth assets would, I think, be something which would be difficult and fair to duty in a way that would not be good.
And I would just add very simply that trustees would probably welcome the option to be able to, with greater fund becoming available, to be able to invest in that way, as long as it is in keeping with their overall strategy for the scheme and taking into account the timescales for that scheme, but not to be mandated.
If I may just say finally, I mean, again, from talking to our members, what they say is if we have long-term stability regarding the government's industrial strategy for the UK, and we have government action, say, doing shared cost on key transition economic issues like in the green side of things, that's the kind of thing that will just naturally draw this pension fund money into the UK. We think the government should more think of pension fund money the way it does it about foreign direct investment. What is it that we can do in the UK to make ourselves the kind of place that everybody wants to put their money into it, rather than just sort of mandating others to pay into it without it meriting investment?
And indeed, I think if they did that, if there was the right regulatory environment, if there were the right incentives for capital to flow, foreign direct investment would probably come quite naturally, but so would institutional investment, and to some extent might even crowd in some of that foreign direct investment. But it's all about the right regime.
And a final topic, and this is particularly a question I wanted to put to Carol, that we know, we've heard in the committee a number of times that open defined schemes, defined benefit schemes like yours have been worried that the new funding regime that's heading in our direction might force inappropriate de-risking. I'm wondering how far those worries have been addressed from your perspective so far, or are you still worried that this could turn out to be a problem? And what specific points do you want to see in the final version of the funding code when it appears?
So we welcome that some of the detail has been laid in Parliament, and I would say we also welcome that the unique features of open DB schemes have begun to be acknowledged. Our concerns, however, aren't fully addressed because the devil will be in the detail, and very specifically it will be in the detail of the covenant guidance. I think one of the things that we've emphasised to you today is that our ability to take a long-term view and indeed address issues like ESG is underpinned by the fact that we are an open scheme with a long-term view. And we believe that we have a covenant horizon of 30 years because of the backing that we have of not a single employer but a sector. That's been absolutely integral to our ability to think long-term and to invest for the long term. So our great concern is that if there is anything in that guidance that in any way shortens that covenant horizon, it will have very real-world consequences. And whilst we did the modelling for another reason, we did the modelling to show that the covenant support that we have put in place had a real financial benefit to the sector. It looked at a similar, it can be used as a proxy because it looked at a similar impact. What if we could only look for 20 years rather than 30? And we concluded that the future service contributions from the higher education sector would have needed to be over 3 percentage points higher. That would have been about 330 million more going into the scheme. But basically just to plug the gap from the fact that we wouldn't be able to take such a long-term investment horizon. And so we very much hope we'll be heard. But that covenant horizon piece is the one that's integral for us and integral to our ability to be a long-term investor.
You think you are being heard on that?
Well, we have a very positive and constructive relationship. We've certainly been given the opportunity to make our case. We made our case on the need for it to reflect open schemes, and that has come through. So, you know, I travel in hope that the ability we've had to make our case means that it can be factored in. But as I say, it has real-world consequences for us.
Rachel.
Thank you, Chair. And in relation to the sort of broader range of schemes that will be of all sizes that will be subject to the new code, the regulations are broadly as expected, so they continue to require a low reliance on the covenant type target at the point at which the scheme becomes significantly mature. That definition is awaited. And as Carol has said, the concerns that open schemes had expressed seem to be being incorporated. What we await in the DB code in particular for the broader range of schemes, whether open or closed, is sufficient flexibility to be able to fund the schemes on the basis that is specific to those circumstances. And in addition, given the improvements in funding positions for a large number of schemes over the last couple of years, we await the flexibility for trustees and sponsors to be able to target a range of different outcomes, including running on the scheme as well as an alternative to buying out.
If I could comment, perhaps, I think, as both have said, I think the new regulations are a significant improvement on what was there before, and they have addressed a number of the issues that were identified. They have introduced a new term, which I think has caused problems, which is talking about reasonable certainty when it comes to looking at covenant longevity. The requirement is that the trustees need to take into account reasonable certainty when they decide on the length of that longevity. Now, you assess whether it's 20 years or 30 years is still very unusual. Most schemes I work with don't have reasonable certainty that lasts beyond 5 years or even more than that, and that includes some open schemes. And I think for those schemes, how that gets interpreted and how covenant advisors interpret that could be quite a significant challenge. So that's the one area where I think there are issues.
And even open schemes would share
yeah,
concern
and
on that.
I certainly know of open schemes which are significantly concerned about that. The second issue is about just how much flexibility there really is when it comes to what the consultation response said is there's flexibility in part because this is all about how you fund, not about how you actually invest. The requirement for how you fund is that when you get to low dependency, your assets have to be highly resilient to movements in market changes, to short-term market changes. That highly resilient requirement for the more mature schemes means that we have to assume a pretty low-risk investment strategy and therefore a very conservative funding target when we're looking at the funding target. If schemes are actually funded to that level, then there's very little incentive for trustees to take additional risk as the system currently stands. They're doing their duties, they'll be de-risking and making sure they meet the benefits. From a corporate perspective, there's very little incentive, as the regime currently exists, to take any risk if they're already funded to the right target, because they're on the hook if it goes wrong, and potentially on the hook to pay contributions quite quickly if it goes wrong. So there's a sort of practical constraint around that flexibility. There's actually also a legal constraint around that flexibility, and this is where the regulations and the various changes that have been made to the Pensions Funds Act itself become important. There is actually in the primary legislation, for anybody who wants to look it up, section 221B of Part 3, that says that the statement of strategy that the trustee produces needs to explain if their actual investments aren't in line with their funding and investment strategy, and if they aren't, they have to say how they're going to remedy that. Now, I can't see trustees wanting to, for too long or for too far, go away from that actual funding and investment strategy and their actual investments, given that legal requirement which actually sits in the primary legislation. So I think there are some potential constraints there around flexibility.
I only wanted to say that from talking to our members, there is a sense that the regs are more flexible, that's helpful, but there are still lots of issues to answer and to be sure about, and maybe there's still concerns, as you just heard.
Thank you all. You've given us a very interesting set of answers. We're grateful. That concludes our questions to you, and it concludes our meeting. Thank you all very much. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding